In regards to the question of what is a Texan, what makes a Texan, we have to look at a couple of the main industries in Texas that make up that Texas identity. And two of these are the cattle industry and the cotton industry. In the cattle industry, its origins go all the way back to the first Spanish settlers who brought the first cows to Texas. There's also these Spanish settlers who will establish the first cattle ranches in Texas in the late 1600s. By the 1700s, ranchers will raise large herds of cattle in Texas. And by the 1800s, the cattle industry is going to flourish. It's this era from 1865 to 1900, which is where that image of the Texas cowboy really comes from, where the large cattle ranches are going to dominate. The Spanish cattle ranching in the 1730s, the first cattle were brought to feed the missions, the presidios, and the settlers in Texas. The Spanish will build what they call rancheros, where we get our word ranch. These are built near water sources, so usually you see them near rivers, especially. And for the most part, they're going to use what's known as the open range practice. These are wild cattle that are going to roam South Texas. They were turned loose when the missions closed. And in the 1700s, Texas cattle ranchers will round up these open range cows and drive them to New Orleans, where Texans could get a better price for the cattle. And then the cattle would then be sold throughout the United States. Now that you can make money off of it, there's a greater interest in ranching in Texas. Anglo-Americans, as they move into the area, are going to adopt Spanish ranching traditions. And one of these traditions, one of these unique things to Texas, is the Texas Longhorn, a very distinctive breed of cattle. It's Spanish cattle that mixed with European cattle during the open range area, and as these cattle intermingled, they made the Longhorn, which is a smaller cow. It's not as big or as fat as other cattle that are sold for beef, but the Texas Longhorn is a very tough cow. Tough cattle, can survive in the harsh Texas conditions, and so it adapts to its environment and its way of life. As a result, cattle ranching is going to grow in Texas as people realize that they could make money from cattle ranching. The market is going to expand. It's going to expand during the 1800s. The price of beef is low in Texas because there were so many cows, law of supply and demand. Now, we had an excess of cows, but the price of beef was higher in other parts of the United States because the demand for beef was higher, because they didn't have the large herds like Texas did. So these early cattle drives were small. Like we said, they would take them to New Orleans, where the cattle could be sold to the United States. One of the trails that they would follow is known as the Shawnee Trail, which would trail cattle up into Oklahoma, where they could then be sold also. The people who moved the cattle along these trails were known as drovers because they're driving the cattle. So a drover is someone who moves livestock overland to market. Something that's going to cause a major increase in the Texas cattle industry is the California Gold Rush in 1849, when tens of thousands of people will move west to California, specifically to San Francisco, to take advantage of the gold rush to try to get rich. They need food, and so now the idea is to drive the cattle to San Francisco, drive them west to California. During the Civil War, Texas is going to be cut off from all of these markets in the east that were buying their cattle, and the cattle herds are going to grow because they're just sort of ignored. Prices are going to fall. Cattle aren't worth anything in Texas because there's so many of them, and Texans have nowhere to sell their cows. And so the cattle are just sort of turned loose during the Civil War, and they're going to grow in number. But after the Civil War, now the East needs food. The eastern United States needs food for the people that are moving to the cities, that are living in the cities, who work in the factories. And so in the East, you have a very high price for beef. And now with the railroads, as they are moving west of the Mississippi River, you can get the cattle anywhere and across the country. So it creates a national market for Texas cattle. And in 1866 alone, 1 year after the Civil War has come to an end, 260,000 cattle will be driven along the Shawnee Trail to Missouri, where they can then be put on the railroads and sold to people in the east, and Texans can make money. There are a lot of profits and problems with the cattle industry. The cost to move the cows was about $1 per head, but the profit was huge. You could make $40 to $50 a head when the cattle were sold. So for the ranch owners, for the people that own the herds, that's a lot of money at this time. Problems, though, is Texas Longhorns had ticks on them that carried a disease called Texas fever. And Texas fever was fatal to cows. The Longhorns were immune to it, so it didn't affect them. But other cattle would die. So as the Texas herds would be driven through Missouri, through Arkansas, places like that, these ranchers and farmers, the ticks would get on their cows, it would kill their cows. And so ranchers and farmers in Arkansas and Missouri did not want to let the cattle drives through, to the extent that you had violence. You had armed citizens of Arkansas and Missouri refusing to allow the Texas cattle drives to come through their region. As a result, a man by the name of Joseph G. McCoy will urge the railroads to build further west into Kansas so they could bypass Arkansas and Missouri, move where there's less people, and they can still get the cattle to the markets. As a result, we get what is known as the Great Cattle Trails in American history. The railroads will build west into Kansas, specifically Abilene, Kansas, is a major destination for cattle drives. Others, Sedalia, Ogallala, Nebraska, these are areas that the railroads are going to move to. One of the first great cattle trails is the Chisholm Trail, created by Jeff Chisholm. It's the main trail into Kansas. And from 1867 to 1884, over 5 million cattle will travel north along the Chisholm Trail, where they will then be loaded on railroads and sold to the east, specifically Chicago, where they'll be slaughtered. Over time, ranches are going to grow up along the Chisholm Trail. The trail is going to be fenced off, and so it's going to require new trails, and the trails are going to move further and further west as settlement moves into the Great Plains of the United States. The next major trail is the Great Western Trail. In 1876 is when it's established. It becomes the new major trail for driving cattle north. It's going to go to Dodge City, Kansas, and Ogallala, Nebraska. And from 1876 to 1884, between 3 and 5 million cattle will travel along the Great Western Trail. A third major trail is the Goodnight Loving Trail, created by Charles Goodnight, was a rancher in West Texas, and he's going to go west through the Texas Panhandle up into Colorado and Wyoming, and using Colorado, Denver area as his area where he's taking his cattle to. So he builds a further western trail that they can then sell the cows on. Well, as time progresses, by the 1880s, the major railroads have now come to Texas. And so you don't have to drive your cattle all the way to Kansas or Colorado or Nebraska to sell them. The railroad is in Texas. And now that the railroad is there, ranchers, since they don't have to travel as far, are going to build large ranches. So we see the rise of these large, great Texas ranches that are part of the Texas identity. Also with that, we get in Fort Worth is where you get the stockyards. This is a major destination now. You just have to drive your cattle to Fort Worth. At the stockyards, you can load them up on the railroads and sell them there. They'd also have meat packing plants there. Another major impact on the cattle industry is the influence of refrigeration. Cattle used to be shipped live, and so when they're shipped live, you have to pay by the pound to the railroad to ship the cows, but then the cows get to the meat packing plants in Chicago, they're slaughtered, and not all of the cow is being used, and so the rancher is paying to ship parts of the cow that are just going to get thrown out. With the invention of refrigeration, the cattle can be slaughtered in Fort Worth, and then everything that's being paid to ship on the railroad is then going to be sold later for a profit. So the meat packing companies and the ranchers make a larger profit, and so refrigeration is going to have a huge impact on it. So we're going to get, again, several major ranches in Texas. This is where, again, that image of the Texas rancher, the big cowboy, all of that comes in. One of these ranches, the major ones, is the King Ranch in South Texas, created by Richard King. His wife, Henrietta King, is going to expand it after his death to where it has over 1 million acres. And the King Ranch is still a working major ranch in South Texas. Another major ranch is the J.A. Ranch, established by Charles Goodnight. He's going to establish this in Palo Duro Canyon. He had served as a scout with the U.S. Army when they were fighting the Native Americans. He had seen the canyon, and its walls created a natural fence for his cows. So he's going to build the J.A. Ranch as a major ranch there in Palo Duro Canyon. Another one, the Matador Ranch, also in the panhandle of Texas in 1878 is when it's created. The Matador Ranch will have over 861,000 acres. It's going to be near the Caprock Escarpment. And the Matador Ranch is also, it's owned by a group of investors from Great Britain who see it as a business venture. They don't even live in West Texas. It's these businessmen from Great Britain who will invest in the ranch as a way to make money. And then a fourth major ranch in Texas, this is also in the Panhandle, but is so big it will spread into New Mexico, is the XIT Ranch. It's the largest ranch in Texas. It will have over 3 million acres, and it's again owned by a group of investors, and they're going to receive this land as a deal from the Texas government, where the XIT Ranch receives the 3 million acres in exchange for the owners of the ranch paying for the construction of the new Texas Capitol building. The red granite Capitol building in Austin is paid for by the XIT Ranch because they received this land. With the rise of these ranches, though, we see a change in the open range. Land is going to be fenced off, and the open range area comes to an end. And one of the things we also see with the end of the open range is the end of what are known as the Mustangs, the wild Mustangs in Texas and mostly in the United States. When the Spanish left the West in the 1600s, they just turned their horses loose as well as their cows. So Mustangs are wild horses who were the descendants of these Spanish horses, and the Mustang herds just roamed the West, sort of a symbol now of the freedom and independence of the American West. The Mustangs were very important to the Native American way of life. So as a result, Anglos in the West are going to round up the Mustangs, and they're going to sell the horses, or the horses will just be slaughtered and used for dog food and other things as a way to get them off the land and to allow the ranchers to have their own land, and also to hurt Native Americans, to take away their source of transportation. The government is going to sponsor the killing of these horses because of the hope to force Native Americans onto reservations and open up more land for ranching and farming, so they will pay people to go and kill wild Mustangs. As a result, like with the buffalo, the Mustangs are almost completely wiped out in the United States. It will take a government effort to save what few Mustangs are left. There are still some that exist on federal land in the West, but there are no Mustangs left in Texas. Another impact of the end of the open range is a rise in sheep ranching, that ranchers will, and especially in sort of central Texas, will raise large herds of sheep where they will section off, fence off their land for their sheep, which will stop the cows being able to be driven through that area. The most important factor in the end of the open range, though, is the invention of the barbed wire fence. A barbed wire, while a simple invention, is one of those major inventions that will change world history. It's invented by a man by the name of Joseph Glidden. Barbed wire is important because it's cheap, it's easy to install, and so ranchers begin fencing their land to control grass and also control water sources. With the railroad expansion, meant you didn't have to drive your cattle to markets, so I could just keep my cattle in one area and not have to take the time to drive them. As the fences are going to go up, though, you get conflict between these large ranchers and small herders who are trying to round up cattle and drive them to market. This leads to what's known as the fence cutting wars in Texas, where you will have literally physical fights between the herders who are trying to maintain the open range era and these ranchers now that say, well, I own this land, this is my water source, you can't use it. You can't cross it. And the fighting will become enough that in 1884, the Texas legislature will pass a law making it a felony to cut someone's fence in Texas. That to So it becomes a big crime just to cut somebody's fence, and so that's going to put an end to it. By 1900, though, the cattle industry is a major industry in Texas is going to decline. It still exists. It's still there. It's still part of our image, but its peak era is going to start to drop off by 1900 because of overproduction, overexpansion, because of the high prices in the East. So many cows are grown that it's going to, or raised, that it's going to cause prices to drop. Also, overgrazing of land is going to reduce the food supply for the cattle, and that's going to cause financial hardships. And then, as prices are going to fall, that many ranchers are going to sell their land or they're going to go bankrupt because they had overexpanded. The other major industry that we're talking about today is farming in Texas. Farmers had moved west, like we talked about, that Stephen F. Austin intentionally sought out people who had experienced growing cotton in the American South, who were slave owners, who had experience with, because he wanted to bring the plantation system into his colony when he created his colony. After the Civil War, farmers are going to move west in search of farmland, not just to Texas, but throughout the American West, because of a law known as the Homestead Act that Congress passed in 1863 that said anyone who would move west could get 160 acres of land free if they would move west and farm that land for 5 years. So farmers are going to, following the Homestead Act, are going to push into the Texas Panhandle and West Texas, but they're going to have a new type of farming. We didn't have a lot of rivers or receive enough rain to support traditional farming, but land was cheap and plentiful, so that's going to attract people. They're going to adopt a new technique known as dry farming or dry land farming. This is a technique where whenever it rains, a farmer goes and plows deeper than they normally would. They plant their seeds, and it traps the seed underground in this wet, muddy soil with a layer of what's called dust mulch on top, of dry dirt on top, and then allows the crops to grow in places along the Great Plains that didn't get enough rain, that hadn't had agriculture before. And so now, like the Great Plains, West Texas, you have a massive influx of farming, and they're going to grow specific crops of wheat, of sorghum, and cotton, because these are cash crops that could be sold for money. Railroad companies are also going to grow. They're going to encourage the growth of towns along the railroads. They're going to encourage agriculture, because if a town grows, that means there's more people to ride the railroad. There's also more people to ship stuff along the railroad, which means more money for the railroads. They're going to encourage farming, because if the farmers raise cotton in West Texas, they're going to have to sell it. And so that means it's goods to be shipped to market along the railroad. And cotton is the main crop in Texas. The phrase we use is cotton is king. It's going to make more money than all other Texas crops combined. With the removal of Native Americans from the plains, this opens up more land for farming. And then the railroad allows cotton farmers to ship their crop all over the country. And since dryland farming works in the Texas Panhandle, that's what most of these farmers are going to do. So we see a big influx of cotton farmers into West Texas. They are going to face some difficulties, one of which is in the late 1800s, Egypt and India, or the countries in Asia and Africa, are going to start growing cotton. They're going to put more cotton on the market, and that's going to make cotton prices crash. With farming in Texas in the West, we also see a new form of farm labor. Farmers, not every farmer is going to own their land. Some are going to rent it. This is what's known as tenant farming. A tenant farmer is a farmer who works land owned by another and pays either rent in cash or a share of the crops. So a lot of the farmers in West Texas are going to be tenant farmers. Another type we see is what's known as sharecropping. These are farmers who are provided tools, seeds, and supplies in exchange for a share of their crops. Sharecroppers are going to generally end up being in debt to the person who is providing this. The supplies they're provided are going to be more generally worth more than the amount they make for their crops. So they end up having to owe. Sharecropping is going to be used in Texas and throughout the American South as a way to keep African Americans in debt to white landowners and keep the African Americans tied to the land and in service to the owners. So now that slavery's over, Southerners will use sharecropping as a way to try to keep African Americans in a form of servitude working for the white landowners. Farmers are going to challenge or face a lot of challenges under tenant farming. They thought that tenant farming was a way to own land, that they could work this land, make some money, save it up, and buy their own land. The landowners, though, are going to charge high rents that were hard to pay back. The environment was very hard. Crop prices are going to fluctuate when prices are low. Farmers will grow more cotton to try to compensate for the low price. But that's going to cause the prices to keep going down under the law of supply and demand. Ultimately, farming is going to lead to more small towns in West Texas along the railroads and the end of the frontier.